In fairy tales, wicked stepmothers often use poisoned apples or dark magic, but in the bloody history of the Danish monarchy, the most terrifying stepmother needed none of that. She needed only one weapon: patience. Juliana Maria, a woman who spent her youth living in the shadows, despised and forgotten on the fringes of the reign of her stepson, the mad King Christian VII. But she didn't rest. She waited, observed the king's madness, recorded the queen's scandals, and when the opportunity arose on a fateful ball, she emerged from the shadows to carry out a ruthless purge, forcing her stepson to sign the arrest orders that would seal his friend's fate, banishing her daughter-in-law, and seizing the throne for her own bloodline. Meet the most dangerous woman in 18th century Denmark. She proved that revenge doesn't need noise, it only needs to be cold. Some details survive as rumor, others as documents. We'll separate what's recorded from what's whispered. So let's follow the paper trail. Who signed what, and who benefited? Because in royal courts, the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, it's a signature. Let's go back before the blood and the ink to 1752. A foggy harbor, a young German princess stepping off a boat, expecting a fairy tale and finding a ghost story instead. If you were a betting man in the 18th century, you wouldn't have put money on Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel becoming a power player. She was born in 1729, a minor princess from a minor German duchy. She was educated to be a wife, a mother, and a cipher, a blank slate upon which a husband could write his dynasty. She was not considered a great beauty. She was plain, sensible, and stiff. In the marriage market of European royalty, she was steady inventory, not a prize. But in Denmark, there was a vacancy. King Frederick V was a man broken by grief. His first wife, Queen Louise, had been the darling of the nation, beautiful, vibrant, and deeply loved. When she died young, the king and the country went into a state of collective mourning that bordered on hysteria. But a king needs a queen, and a kingdom needs spares. The advisors looked at their maps and their family trees, and they pointed a finger at Brunswick. They chose Juliana Maria. She arrived in Denmark expecting the pomp and adoration due a queen. Instead, she was met with a wall of ice. The people didn't want a new queen, they wanted Louise back. When Juliana appeared on the balcony, the crowds were thin and silent. When she walked through the court, the whispers were audible. She's not as pretty as Louise. She's too stiff. She speaks with a heavy German accent. Imagine the psychological toll. You are 23 years old, in a foreign country, married to a man who keeps a portrait of his dead wife on his desk and weeps into his wine. King Frederick V was a popular monarch, but in private, he was a wreck, an alcoholic and a hedonist who used women and liquor to numb his pain. Juliana was not his partner. She was his nurse and his broodmare. She quickly realized that she could never compete with the ghost. Louise was perfect because she was dead. She would never age, never make a mistake, never have a bad day. Juliana was alive, flawed, and present, which made her the target for everyone's resentment. And then there was the boy, Christian, the crown prince, the son of the beloved Louise. If Juliana was the intruder, Christian was the golden child. He was delicate, pretty, and sharp-witted. But even as a child, there was something wrong. A frantic energy, a flicker in the eyes that suggested the lights were flickering in the palace of his mind. The relationship between a stepmother and a stepson is difficult in the best of times. In the pressure cooker of the Danish court, it was toxic from day one. To young Christian, Juliana was the woman trying to erase his mother. To Juliana, Christian was the obstacle. As long as he lived, her own son, Prince Frederick, born a year after the marriage, would be nothing. Just a spare, just a footnote. We have letters and diaries from this period that paint a picture of Juliana's isolation. She retreated into rigidity. If the court found her boring, she would be boring. She emphasized etiquette, piety, and protocol. She became the moral queen, a stark contrast to the debauchery of her husband and the flightiness of her stepson. It was a defense mechanism. If she couldn't be popular, she would be correct. She built a fortress of manners around herself. But inside that fortress, she was watching. She saw the king drinking himself to death. She saw the crown prince becoming increasingly erratic. And she began to calculate. In 1766, the inevitable happened. Frederick V died, his liver finally giving up the ghost. At the age of 17, Christian VII became King of Denmark. The Mad King. That is how history remembers him. Modern writers have debated his diagnosis, often describing severe mental illness, but the court knew one thing for certain. The king was unstable. He hallucinated, he was paranoid, and he had a penchant for self-harm and violent outbursts. Contemporary reports describe him roaming Copenhagen at night, breaking things as if trying to break himself. Accounts describe humiliating self-destructive episodes that shocked even a hard-drinking court. For Juliana Maria, this was the moment of maximum danger. As the Queen Dowager, she was technically the highest-ranking woman in the land, but Christian hated her. He called her the crone or the witch. He delighted in mocking her piety. He marginalized her completely, pushing her and her son, Prince Frederick, to the very edge of the court. They were uninvited from dinners, left off guest lists, and treated like embarrassing relatives. Then, things got worse. Christian married his cousin, the English Princess Caroline Matilda. She was 15, fresh-faced, and tragically unprepared for a husband who preferred the company of his drinking buddies to her bed. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee. This is the turning point of the story, the catalyst that woke the sleeping dragon in Juliana Maria. Struensee was a German doctor, a man of the Enlightenment, an intellectual radical who believed in freedom of the press, the abolition of torture, and the rights of the peasantry. He was hired to treat the king's mental illness. Struensee did something no one else could. He controlled the king. He calmed him down. He became a father figure to the orphan monarch, and then he became the lover of the lonely queen. It was a scandal of epic proportions. The doctor, the king, and the queen formed a bizarre love triangle. Struensee effectively took over the government. He began issuing cabinet orders in the king's name, more than 1,000 in just over a year. He was modernizing Denmark at breakneck speed, bypassing the nobility, the council, and the military, to Juliana Maria sitting in her exile at Fredensborg Palace. This was not just a scandal, it was an abomination. Look at it through her eyes. She was a traditionalist. She believed in the divine order of things. God put kings on thrones and nobles in castles. Now here was a middle-class doctor sleeping with the queen and rewriting the laws of the land. It was chaos. It was unnatural. But the personal insult was deeper. Struensee and Caroline Matilda had a child, Princess Louise Augusta. The court gossip and Juliana's own spies confirmed that the baby looked nothing like the king and everything like the doctor. This was the key. If the queen's children were bastards, then the line of succession was tainted. If Christian VII was insane and his heirs were illegitimate, who was next in line? Her son, hereditary Prince Frederick. Juliana Maria looked at the chessboard. The king was mad. The queen was an adulteress. The ruler of the country was a usurper. The nobility was angry at losing their power. The army was angry at budget cuts. The people were confused by the rapid changes. The atmosphere in Copenhagen was turning toxic. Anti-German sentiment was rising, ironic given Juliana's origins, but she played the part of the Danish patriot perfectly. Pamphlets were circulating, calling the queen a whore and Struensee a sorcerer. Juliana didn't start the fire, but she brought the gasoline. She began to hold secret meetings. She reached out to the disgruntled nobles, the fired generals, the conservative clergy. She became the figurehead of the opposition. She wasn't charismatic, but she was available. She was the safe harbor for everyone who hated the new regime. Her chief co-conspirator was Ove Høegh Guldberg, a nationalist academic who provided the ideological justification for the coup. But make no mistake, Juliana was the spine of the operation. She was the one with the royal blood. Without her sanction, it was just a mutiny. With her, it was a rescue mission. January 16, 1772. The masked ball at Christiansborg Palace. It is a scene straight out of a movie. Upstairs in the Great Hall, the music is playing. Queen Caroline Matilda is dancing with Struensee. They are laughing, drunk on love and power, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor is rotting beneath their feet. The king is there, manic and distracted, playing cards. Downstairs in Juliana Maria's apartments, the lights are low. The conspirators are gathered. The tension is unbearable. If they fail, they will be executed for treason. Heads will roll, literally. There is a moment of hesitation. The plan requires them to enter the king's bedroom, wake him up and force him to sign arrest warrants for his wife and his best friend. It is a violation of every protocol. Who has the nerve to do it? Juliana Maria. She looks at the men around her, generals, counts, politicians, and she steals them. She reminds them of the stakes. She tells them they are doing this for God, for the king, for Denmark. She frames the coup not as a power grab, but as a liberation. They are saving the king from the evil doctor. Before dawn, they enter the king's chamber. The palace is dark. The group moves. They disarm the sentries. They burst into the king's bedchamber. Christian VII wakes up in a panic. He sees his stepmother, the woman he hates, standing over him with a candle. Behind her are men with swords. He is terrified. He thinks they are there to kill him. Sign, they tell him. They shove the papers in front of him. Arrest warrants, one for Count Struensee, one for Count Brandt, his accomplice, and one, the most shocking of all, for Her Majesty, Queen Caroline Matilda. The king hesitates. He loves Struensee in his own twisted way. He doesn't want to hurt his mother, as he called the queen, but Juliana leans in. She speaks to him in the voice of the authority he fears. She tells him there is a plot against his life. She tells him Struensee plans to kill him. She lies without hesitation, calm, precise, and utterly convincing. The king, trembling, weeping, takes the quill. He scrawls his signature, Christian Rex. With that stroke of ink, Juliana Maria effectively ended the Age of Enlightenment in Denmark. The arrests were brutal. Struensee was dragged from his bed in his nightshirt. The queen was cornered in her chambers. She tried to run to the king, screaming for help, but the soldiers blocked her path. She fought them, physically fought them, but she was overpowered. She was thrown into a carriage with her infant daughter and driven to Kronborg Castle, Hamlet's castle, a prisoner of state. Juliana Maria stood at the window and watched the carriages leave. The sun was coming up over a new Denmark. The ghost of Queen Louise was finally exorcised. The pretty young queen was gone. The doctor was in chains. The dowager queen had won. Most coups end with the seizure of power. For Juliana, the hard work was just starting. She had the warrants, but she needed to justify them to the world. You cannot just lock up a sister of the King of England without a good reason. She needed a show trial. And she needed blood. The trial of Struensee was a farce, but it was a necessary one. Juliana orchestrated a propaganda campaign that would make a modern spin doctor blush. The press was unleashed to paint Struensee as a monster who had seduced the queen with aphrodisiacs and planned to overthrow the king. But the cruelty was in the details. Juliana wanted Struensee dead, but she wanted him humiliated first. He was tortured. He was forced to confess to the affair, a confession that doomed the queen. And Caroline Matilda, Juliana couldn't execute her. Executing her would have risked a serious diplomatic crisis with Britain, but she could destroy her reputation. The queen's marriage was annulled. She was stripped of her title, her children, and her dignity. This is where the wicked stepmother moniker truly earns its weight. When Caroline Matilda was eventually exiled to Germany, she was forced to leave her children behind. The crown prince, Frederick, Juliana's step-grandson, and the infant Louise Augusta were kept in Copenhagen. Juliana Maria took custody of them. Imagine the horror. The woman who destroyed their mother was now their guardian. She raised them. She looked at the crown prince every day, knowing she had orchestrated the destruction of his happiness. Did she treat them well? By the standards of the time, she was not physically abusive, but she was cold. She ensured they knew their place. She controlled their education, their servants, their lives. For the next 12 years, from 1772 to 1784, Denmark was ruled by a triumvirate: Juliana Maria, her son, and the politician Ove Høgh Guldberg. But let's be clear, Juliana was the engine of the regime. The king was still the king, but he was a puppet. He was trotted out for state dinners, dressed in fine clothes, and then put back in his box. With the king incapacitated, policy flowed through her circle, fronted by the hereditary prince and driven by Guldberg. She rolled back almost all of Struensee's reforms. Her regime re-empowered the nobility, narrowed press freedoms, and restored censorship. It was a calculated return to a climate of fear, a dark time for liberty, but a golden time for Juliana. She commissioned portraits of herself. She had a statue made. She founded the Royal Porcelain Factory. She wanted to be seen not as a usurper, but as the mother of the nation. But there is a flaw in the plan of every tyrant. They forget that children grow up. While Juliana was busy ruling the kingdom and basking in her belated glory, the little boy she had taken hostage, Crown Prince Frederick, was watching. He was quiet. He was obedient. He was, to all appearances, a dullard. Juliana underestimated him. She thought he was broken like his father. She didn't realize that beneath the shy exterior, he was burning with a cold, focused hatred. He remembered his mother. He remembered the night she was taken away, and he was waiting for his turn to hold the knife. The executioner's axe that fell on April 28, 1772, did more than sever the head of Johann Friedrich Struensee. It severed the timeline of Danish history, creating a brutal demarcation between the era of dangerous hope and the era of suffocating order. For the people of Copenhagen, the spectacle on the East Common was a grim carnival. Thousands upon thousands gathered to watch the butchery of the man who had tried to set them free. But for Juliana Maria, watching from the gilded safety of the palace, the blood on the scaffold was not a tragedy. It was a sealant. It was the mortar that would hold the bricks of her new regime together. With the sorcerer doctor dead and the adulterous queen exiled to Shelley in Germany, the stage was finally cleared of rivals. The wicked stepmother was no longer a supporting character lurking in the wings. She was the playwright, the director, and the lead actress of the Danish court. The years that followed were defined by a discipline so tight it felt like a room with no air. It was the silence of a clock that has been wound too tight. Juliana Maria did not merely roll back the reforms of the Enlightenment. She aggressively pursued a policy of Danishness that bordered on xenophobia, a calculated move to distance her reign from the German-influenced chaos of the Struensee years. It is a supreme irony of her life that she, a German princess who had arrived speaking not a word of Danish, became the architect of Danish nationalism. She introduced Danish as the language of command in the army, a radical shift in a military dominated by German mercenaries. She mandated that government business be conducted in the native tongue. To the peasantry and the burgeoning middle class, these moves looked like patriotism. To the cynical observer, they were a masterclass in branding. By wrapping herself in the flag, she made opposition to her rule look like treason against Denmark itself. But the true drama of this era was not played out in the council chambers, where laws were repealed and taxes were reinstated. It was played out in the nurseries and schoolrooms of Christiansborg Palace. This is where the narrative of Juliana Maria shifts from political thriller to psychological horror. She was now the guardian of the crown prince, Frederick, the son of the woman she had destroyed. It is a dynamic that feels ripped from the pages of the Brothers Grimm, but the reality was far more nuanced and far more damaging than any fairy tale. Juliana Maria did not lock the boy in a tower or feed him poisoned apples. Instead, she subjected him to a regime of calculated neglect and psychological crushing, designed to ensure he would never grow up to be a threat to her own son, the hereditary prince, Frederick. The crown prince was a sickly, frightened child. He had witnessed the arrest of his mother. He had felt the terror of the coup. Now, he was left in the care of the woman who had orchestrated it all. Juliana Maria's strategy was simple. She needed the crown prince to survive because he was the legitimizing figurehead of the monarchy. But she needed him to be broken. She needed a puppet, not a king. Under her supervision, the boy was isolated. He was denied the company of other children. His education was strictly controlled, focusing on religious dogma and obedience rather than statecraft or philosophy. While her own son was treated with deference and groomed for power, the crown prince was treated as a nuisance, a damaged relic of a shameful past. There are accounts from the court that paint a chilling picture of this domestic tyranny. The crown prince was often dressed poorly, his clothes ill-fitting and plain, while Juliana's son paraded in the finest silks. At dinner, the crown prince would sit in silence, ignored by the adults, watching the woman who had exiled his mother hold court. It was a daily reinforcement of his powerlessness. Juliana Maria cultivated an atmosphere where the crown prince was viewed as slow, difficult, and potentially inheriting the madness of his father, King Christian VII. By spreading these whispers, she prepared the court for the eventuality that he might never be fit to rule, thereby clearing the path for her own bloodline to take the regency permanently. Yet, in her desire to control everything, Juliana Maria made a fatal error. She forgot that trauma does not always break a child. Sometimes it hardens them. Young Frederick was not slow, he was watchful. His silence was not stupidity, it was a survival strategy. In the vacuum of love that defined his childhood, he developed a fierce internalized loyalty to the memory of his mother. He had no photographs, only the vague, dream-like recollections of a woman who had held him and wept. Juliana Maria became the embodiment of everything evil in his world. Every slight, every cold look, every restriction was cataloged in the boy's mind. She was forging the weapon that would eventually be turned against her, tempering the steel of his character in the freezing cold of her own affection. While the domestic Cold War simmered, Juliana Maria lived the life she had always felt denied her. She was the undisputed First Lady of the kingdom. The Mad King, Christian VII, was reduced to a prop in her theater of power. He was kept in a state of managed isolation, surrounded by keepers loyal to the Queen Dowager. Occasionally, he would have moments of lucidity, flashes of the old wit that had once charmed foreign courts, but these were quickly smothered. Juliana ensured that the king signed whatever papers were placed in front of him. The Council of State became a rubber stamp for her wishes. She was, in all but name, the absolute monarch of Denmark. Her court was a place of rigid etiquette and heavy piety. The wild libertine parties of the early reign were replaced by solemn balls and endless church services. Juliana Maria viewed herself as the moral cleanser of the nation. She patronized the arts and sciences, not out of a love for discovery, but out of a desire to project an image of civilized stability. The founding of the Royal Porcelain Factory was her crowning cultural achievement. She took a personal interest in the chemistry of the glazes and the designs of the blue fluting. It was a perfect metaphor for her rule. Hard, polished, beautiful to look at, but cold to the touch and prone to shattering if mishandled. However, the wicked stepmother was not without her own anxieties. As the years ticked by, the ghost of Caroline Matilda refused to fade completely. From her exile in Chile, the deposed queen maintained a secret correspondence with sympathizers in Copenhagen and, more dangerously, with the British court. Her brother was King George III of England, and the treatment of his sister remained a sore point in Anglo-Danish relations. There were constant rumors of counter-coups, of British fleets appearing on the horizon to restore the queen. Juliana Maria lived in a state of high paranoia. Her spy network was extensive. Mail was opened. Servants were bribed. She saw treason in every shadow. This paranoia justified her harshness. She believed she was the only thing standing between Denmark and a return to the chaos of the Struensee era. The greatest threat, however, was time itself. The crown prince was growing up. By 1780, he was 12 years old, no longer a toddler, who could be easily dismissed, but a young man beginning to ask questions. Juliana Maria tried to tighten the leash. She appointed loyalists to be his tutors, men whose job was to report on his every thought and to instill in him a sense of his own inadequacy. They told him he was sickly. They told him he was not smart enough to understand politics. They tried to make him dependent on his step-uncle, Juliana's son, for every decision. But there were cracks in the fortress. Not everyone at court was loyal to the Dowager Queen. There were men who remembered the old days, men who chafed under the rigid conservatism of the Goldberg regime. They saw the crown prince not as a broken boy, but as a potential savior. Quietly, subtly, a circle of support began to form around the lonely teenager. A valet here, a fencing master there, small whispers of encouragement that contradicted the narrative of his worthlessness. Someone slipped him books. Someone told him the truth about his mother's exile, contradicting the lies Juliana had fed him for years. One of the most poignant aspects of this period was the relationship between the crown prince and his sister, Princess Louise Augusta. Though Juliana Maria had separated them from their mother, she could not separate them from each other. They formed a bond of shared trauma, a us-against-the-world alliance that Juliana failed to recognize as dangerous. Louise Augusta, vibrant and intelligent, and possessing much of Struensee's fire, became her brother's confidant. In the hushed corridors of the palace, away from the prying eyes of the dowager's spies, they dreamed of a different future. As the decade turned, the atmosphere in Copenhagen grew heavy with anticipation. The crown prince's confirmation was approaching. The rite of passage that would mark his transition to adulthood. In the eyes of the law, a confirmed prince was capable of ruling. Juliana Maria knew this date was the expiration date on her absolute power, unless she could maneuver around it. She began to lay plans to change the structure of the government to ensure that the Council of State would remain supreme even after the prince came of age. She was trying to build a cage that would hold a grown man as effectively as it had held a child. She looked at the teenage Frederick and saw a sullen, awkward boy who stuttered when he was nervous and looked at his shoes when she spoke. She thought she had succeeded in crushing him. She thought he was weak. It was the classic mistake of the narcissist. She could not imagine an interior life richer than the one she perceived. She did not see the fire burning behind the boy's downcast eyes. She did not know that he was already writing secret letters. She did not know that the stupid boy had a memory like a steel trap and a heart filled with a cold, patient rage. The wicked stepmother sat on her throne of porcelain and fear, convinced that she had won the game. But the pawn she had pushed across the board for 12 years was about to reach the other side. And when a pawn reaches the end of the board, it becomes a queen, or in this case, a king who remembers everything. The clock was ticking toward 1784, and the silence of the palace was about to be broken by the sound of a boy finally finding his voice. The winter was brutal. The sound choked with ice, and Copenhagen felt sealed shut. Inside Christiansborg Palace, the atmosphere was equally frigid, but it was a cold born of complacency. Queen Dowager Juliana Maria, now 54 years old, sat at the apex of her power, secure in the belief that the history of Denmark had frozen in her favor. For 12 years she had ruled as the de facto regent, her will executed by the loyal Ove Goldberg, her son positioned as the heir presumptive, and her stepson, the Crown Prince Frederick, dismissed as a dull, malleable non-entity. She believed she had stopped the clock. She believed that the boy she had mentally beaten into submission would remain a boy forever. But spring was coming, and with it, the most spectacular reversal of fortune in the history of the Danish court. The Crown Prince was now 16. In the eyes of the law, he was a man. His confirmation, the religious rite of passage that signaled his adulthood, was scheduled for April 4th, 1784. Juliana Maria was not blind to the danger this date represented. She knew that technically, a confirmed crown prince had the right to sit in the Council of State. However, she had spent years preparing for this. She had stacked the council with her own creatures, men who owed their positions to her patronage. She had extracted promises. She had drafted new regulations that would strip the prince of any real authority, ensuring he would be nothing more than a silent observer at the table where the adults made the decisions. She looked at Frederick and saw what she wanted to see, a slouching, stuttering teenager with bad skin and no friends. She saw a boy who spent his time drilling his toy soldiers and staring out the window. What she did not see was the mask. For years, Frederick had been playing a role that would have won him applause on any stage in Europe. He had weaponized his perceived stupidity. He knew that intelligence was a threat to his stepmother, so he hid it. He knew that ambition would get him crushed, so he feigned indifference. Beneath the surface of the dullard, however, was a mind sharpened by trauma. Frederick had been secretly meeting with the enemies of the Goldberg regime, men like Andreas Peter Bernstorff, the brilliant statesman whom Juliana had fired years earlier. They met in shadows, exchanging letters in code, whispering in the corners of masquerade balls. The stupid boy was actually the mastermind of a counter-coup. The plan they hatched was breathtaking in its simplicity and its risk. There would be no armies, no barricades, no blood in the streets. They would not storm the palace. They would simply walk into a room and take it. It relied entirely on the element of surprise and the physical possession of one man, the Mad King. The date was set for April 14th, 1784, the first Council of State meeting that the newly confirmed Crown Prince would attend. The morning of the coup began with the usual suffocating rituals of the court. Juliana Maria rose, prayed, and prepared for another day of ruling the kingdom. She had no inkling that the floorboards were about to give way. She assumed the council meeting would be a formality, a chance to welcome the Crown Prince, pat him on the head, and then ignore him while she and Goldberg discussed the budget. At noon, the heavy doors of the council chamber swung open. The room was dominated by a long table covered in green baize. Seated around it were the most powerful men in Denmark, the architects of the Goldberg regime. At the head of the table sat King Christian VII. By now, the king was a ghost of a man, his mind wandering in a labyrinth of hallucinations, his body twitching with nervous energy. He was the ultimate rubber stamp, a living seal of authority that Juliana Maria controlled completely. Next to the king sat his half-brother, the hereditary Prince Frederick, Juliana's son. He was a decent but dim man, completely under his mother's thumb. And then, taking his seat for the first time, was the Crown Prince. He looked pale. He looked nervous. The old men of the council glanced at him with patronizing smiles. Let the boy sit there, they thought. He is harmless. The meeting began. Goldberg started to read the agenda. The droning of voices filled the room. Then, the Crown Prince stood up. The room went quiet. This was not in the script. The boy was supposed to be silent. With a trembling hand but a steady voice, Frederick interrupted the proceedings. He turned to his father, the king. "Your Majesty," he said, "I wish to read a proposal." Before Goldberg or the others could react, Frederick pulled a document from his coat. It was not a minor petition. It was a bombshell. It was an order dissolving the current cabinet, dismissing Goldberg, and reinstating Bernstorff and the old liberal ministers. It declared that from this moment on, no royal order would be valid unless signed by the king and countersigned by the Crown Prince. It was a total usurpation of power. Panic erupted in the chamber. Goldberg shouted that this was illegal. The hereditary prince looked confused, his eyes darting to the door as if looking for his mother. But the key was the king. The Crown Prince placed the document in front of his father. "Sign it, Papa," he urged gently. "Please, sign it." Christian VII looked at his son. In the fog of his madness, perhaps he recognized something. A spark of the old defiance, a memory of the Struensee days, or simply the bond of blood that Juliana Maria had tried so hard to sever. Or perhaps he just liked the idea of signing something new. He dipped his quill. He signed Christian Rex. Pandemonium broke loose. The hereditary prince realized what was happening. He lunged across the table. He wasn't trying to hit the Crown Prince. He was trying to grab the king. The legitimacy of the government resided in the physical body of the monarch. Whoever held the king held the power. What followed was one of the most undignified and dramatic scenes in royal history. A physical tug-of-war broke out over the bewildered Mad King. The Crown Prince grabbed his father's arm and pulled him toward the door. The hereditary prince grabbed the king's other arm and pulled him back. "You are stealing the king," the hereditary prince screamed. "I am saving him," Frederick retorted. The Crown Prince was younger, faster, and driven by a lifetime of suppressed rage. He managed to wrestle his father away from his uncle. He dragged the confused monarch out of the council chamber and down the corridor. Waiting outside, keeping guard, was a young, loyal officer, a sign that Frederick had planned for violence if necessary. They hustled the king down the stairs to a waiting carriage. As they ran, the king, terrified by the shouting and the running, began to weep. "Mutter, mutter," he cried out, calling for the Queen Dowager, the only authority figure he had known for 12 years. But Juliana Maria was not there. She was in her apartments, blissfully unaware that her reign had just ended in a scuffle on the stairs. Frederick shoved his father into the carriage and jumped in after him. The driver cracked the whip. The carriage tore out of the palace gates and into the streets of Copenhagen, carrying the past and the future of Denmark, leaving the wicked stepmother with nothing but an empty chair. Back in the palace, the news traveled up the stairs like a shockwave. A servant burst into Juliana Maria's chambers. The report was disjointed, frantic. "The council is dissolved. Guldberg is fired. The crown prince has taken the king." We can only imagine the sound that escaped her throat. It was the sound of a carefully constructed world shattering into dust. She rushed to the window, but it was too late. The carriage was gone. Her reaction was a mix of fury and disbelief. She stormed through the palace, demanding answers, demanding soldiers, but the power had shifted instantly. The army, the guards, the servants, they all knew how to count. The king had signed the paper. The crown prince had the king. The dowager queen had is nothing. In the span of an hour, Juliana Maria went from being the ruler of the North to being an irrelevant widow. The men who had bowed to her that morning now avoided her gaze. The stupid boy had outmaneuvered the master tactician. He had used her own tools, protocol, the signature, the physical custody of the monarch, against her. The aftermath was swift and brutal, not in blood, but in cold administrative efficiency. Frederick did not execute his stepmother. He did not imprison her. He did something far more insulting. He ignored her. He stripped her of her influence, her access to state papers, and her patronage. He fired Guldberg and the other conspirators, sending them into retirement. But he left Juliana Maria in the palace. He allowed her to keep her title and her allowance. He treated her with icy, impeccable politeness. This was the ultimate revenge. To execute her would have been to acknowledge her power. To ignore her was to declare that she didn't matter. He turned her into a ghost in her own home. For the crown prince, this moment was a vindication of the memory of his mother, Queen Caroline Matilda. Although she had died in exile in 1775, never seeing her son again, Frederick felt that he had finally balanced the scales. The woman who had destroyed his mother was now destroyed herself, not by a headsman's axe, but by the humiliating realization that she had been beaten by the child she abused. The Coup of 1784 is celebrated in Danish history as the beginning of a golden age of liberal reform. Frederick VI, as he would later become, went on to abolish serfdom, reform the legal system, and eventually stand up to Napoleon. But the emotional core of the event was personal. It was a family tragedy reaching its climax. As the sun set on April 14, 1784, Juliana Maria sat alone in her chambers. The silence was back, but it was different now. It was not the silence of fear that she had imposed on others. It was the silence of obsolescence. She had spent 30 years fighting to be the protagonist of the story, fighting to ensure her son would be king. She had schemed, she had signed warrants, she had ruined lives. And in the end, she had lost to the quiet, stuttering boy who had sat at the end of her table, eating his soup and watching her with eyes that missed nothing. The wicked stepmother was still alive, but her story was over. The prince had found his voice, and his first command was for her to disappear. The coup of 1784 is often described in history books as bloodless, a term that is technically accurate but emotionally dishonest. There was no guillotine in the square, no heads on spikes, but a different kind of execution took place inside the walls of Christiansborg Palace. It was a social execution, slow, silent, and absolute. For the next 12 years, until her death in 1796, Juliana Maria was forced to endure the most exquisite torture imaginable for a woman of her ambition. She became a spectator in a world she had once commanded. The new regent, Crown Prince Frederick, ruling on behalf of his insane father, did not banish his stepmother. He was far too clever for that. Exile would have made her a martyr. Instead, he kept her close, trapping her in a gilded cage of protocol. She retained her apartments, her servants, and her title. She was still invited to state dinners. She was still bowed to in the corridors. But she was dead. Every politician knew that to be seen whispering in her ear was career suicide. Every ambassador knew that her influence was now worth less than the wax on a sealed letter. She was a monument to a fallen regime, forced to watch as the boy she had bullied dismantled everything she had built. The atmosphere at court during these twilight years was thick with a toxic politeness. Imagine the dinners at the royal table. At one end sat the mad king, Christian VII, happily oblivious, perhaps playing with his food or muttering to invisible friends. At the other end sat the crown prince, now a young man of steely determination, ruling with the confidence of someone who has survived a predator. And somewhere in the middle sat Juliana Maria and her son, the hereditary prince Frederick. They broke bread together. They exchanged pleasantries about the weather. But beneath the surface, there was a glacier of hatred. The crown prince never raised his voice to her, but he systematically erased her legacy. He reversed her policies on censorship. He opened up the economy. He embraced the very reforms she had spent a decade suppressing. Every decree he signed was a silent rebuke to her governance. He was proving to the nation that the dark days of the Juliana era were over, and he was doing it while she sat in the next room, powerless to stop him. Perhaps the bitterest pill for Juliana Maria was the behavior of her own son. The hereditary prince, the boy for whom she had plotted and sinned, the boy for whose sake she had destroyed a queen and executed a count, turned out to be ordinary. When the coup happened, he did not fight for his mother. He did not rally the troops. He accepted his defeat with a shrug. He was content to live a comfortable, quiet life as a subordinate prince. He lacked her fire. He lacked her hunger. Juliana had poured her soul into a vessel that had a leak. Seeing him content with mediocrity must have been a daily reminder that her great gamble, the destruction of her moral soul for the sake of her dynasty, had been for nothing. As the years ground on, Juliana Maria retreated further into the only sanctuary left to her, the past. She spent her days at Friedensborg Palace, surrounded by the few aging courtiers who still remembered her glory days. They were a sad court of ghosts, reliving the coup of 1772, telling each other that they had saved the country, that history would vindicate them. She wrote letters, thousands of them, trying to explain her actions, trying to curate her own legend. She insisted that she had acted only out of duty, that Struensee was a monster, that she was the true mother of Denmark. It was the desperate spin of a politician who knows the history books are being written by her enemies. But even in her decline, she remained a figure of fascination and fear. To the people of Copenhagen, she was still the Dark Queen. Myths began to accrete around her like barnacles on a sunken ship. They whispered that she was a witch, that she had poisoned the king's mind, that she walked the halls at night cursing the crown prince. She became a folklore villain in her own lifetime. The wicked stepmother narrative was too perfect to resist. It didn't matter that she had founded the porcelain factory or stabilized the currency. She was the woman who had stolen the kingdom. The end, when it came, was quiet. In 1796, at the age of 67, Juliana Maria died. There was no great outpouring of national grief. The court went into the requisite period of mourning, but it was a bureaucratic mourning, not an emotional one. The crown prince, now fully in command and universally respected as the savior of the nation, organized a respectful funeral. He did not desecrate her memory. He simply let it fade. She was buried in Roskilde Cathedral, the resting place of Danish monarchs. She lies there today, not far from Frederick V, the husband who never loved her, and Christian VII, the stepson she drove mad. But the supreme irony of her death is found in the layout of the tombs. Years earlier, the body of Queen Caroline Matilda, the rival Juliana had destroyed, had been buried in shame in Celle, Germany, far from her children and her kingdom. But in the hearts of the Danish people, and certainly in the heart of the crown prince, Caroline Matilda was the true queen. Juliana Maria had the marble sarcophagus and the royal vault, but she had lost the war for memory. She died as she had lived, physically present in the center of power but emotionally exiled to the periphery. With her death, the 18th century in Denmark effectively closed. The era of wigs, absolute monarchs, and palace coups was giving way to the era of Napoleon, war, and constitutional change. But the shadow of Juliana Maria lingered. She left behind a fractured family and a crown prince who, though a reformer, carried the scars of his childhood forever. Frederick VI would grow up to be a king who demanded absolute loyalty, a man who had learned from his stepmother that trust is a weakness and that power must be guarded with an iron fist. In a strange, twisted way, she had taught him how to be a king. She taught him that the throne is a lonely place and that the hand holding the scepter must never shake, even when it is signing the warrant of its own kin. The wicked stepmother was gone, but her creation, the hardened, wary, absolute monarchy of the 19th century, remained. The fairy tale was over, and the moral of the story was bleak. In the Game of Thrones, you can win the coup, you can kill your enemies, you can rule for a decade, but you cannot force a child to love you, and you cannot force history to forgive you. History has a way of reducing complex human beings to single adjectives. Richard III is crooked, Ivan is terrible, and Juliana Maria is irrevocably wicked. But as the 18th century turned into the 19th, and the physical presence of the Dowager Queen faded from the halls of Christiansborg, a strange phenomenon occurred. The woman herself vanished into the crypt, but her fingerprints remained on everything she touched, leaving a legacy far more durable and complicated than the caricature of the evil stepmother suggests. To understand the true weight of Juliana Maria's life, we must look not at the melodrama of the coup, but at the silent, enduring structures she left behind, both in the porcelain shops of Copenhagen and in the psyche of the Danish monarchy. Consider for a moment a dinner plate. If you walk into a home in Denmark today, or indeed into the homes of collectors around the world, you are likely to find a piece of Royal Copenhagen porcelain. It is iconic, white, delicate, painted with those distinct hypnotic blue floral patterns. Turn the plate over, and you will see the trademark 3 blue wavy lines representing the 3 main waterways of Denmark. That factory was Juliana Maria's passion project. She founded it in 1775. She fought for its funding when the treasury was empty. She obsessed over the chemistry of the cobalt blue glaze. It was her attempt to create something beautiful, something permanent, something that said Denmark to the world. There is a profound irony in this. The woman who is remembered for the ugly business of torture, execution, and political betrayal is also the mother of the nation's most delicate aesthetic triumph. Every time someone admires a piece of blue fluted plane, they are admiring the taste and the ambition of the wicked stepmother. She wanted to be the mother of the nation, and in a way, through the clay and the fire of the kiln, she succeeded where she failed in flesh and blood. The porcelain survived. Her reputation did not. It is a testament to the fact that history prefers beauty to power. We keep the plates, but we revile the hand that molded them. But her darker legacy is found in the man she created, King Frederick VI. The crown prince who had wrestled his father from her grip in 1784 ruled Denmark for more than half a century. He is often remembered as a reformer, the man who abolished serfdom and stood with the peasants. But look closer at his personality, and you see the ghost of Juliana Maria staring back. Frederick VI was a man of profound rigidity. He was an autocrat who loathed the idea of a constitution. He managed the state with the same obsessive micromanaging control that his stepmother had used to manage him. He had hated her control, yet he internalized her methods. Psychologists might call this the cycle of trauma. The boy who was watched every second grew up to be a king who watched everyone. Frederick VI's refusal to grant a liberal constitution in the 1830s, his stubborn adherence to the old ways even as Europe democratized, was a direct echo of the lessons learned in the Goldberg era. Juliana Maria had taught him that the world was dangerous, that trust was a liability, and that the only way to survive was to hold the reins so tight your knuckles turned white. She may have lost the throne in 1784, but she ruled from the grave through the paranoia and the absolutism of the stepson she had tormented. Furthermore, we must confront the uncomfortable question of political necessity. It is easy to cast Juliana Maria as the villain who stopped the Enlightenment. Struensee was the dashing hero, the lover, the visionary. But Struensee was also chaotic. He was ruling by decree, bypassing the law, alienating the army, and creating a power vacuum that could have led to civil war, or worse, the dissolution of the monarchy itself. Juliana Maria was a reactionary, yes, but she was also a stabilizer. In her mind, she was the breakwater holding back a tidal wave that threatened to drown her family. Did she save the Danish monarchy? A strong argument can be made that she did. By removing Struensee and restoring the traditional order, she bought the House of Oldenburg another century of survival. She froze the country in a block of ice, preserving the institution of kingship at a time when other monarchies were beginning to crack. It was a loveless, colorless survival, but survival nonetheless. She was the hard pragmatist who did the dirty work that the good people were too squeamish to handle. She was the one who signed the warrant so the king could keep his crown. Yet history is not a court of law. It is a court of feeling. And in the court of feeling, Juliana Maria will always be guilty. Her crime was not just political. It was elemental. She violated the sacred archetypes. She destroyed a mother. She manipulated a madman. She neglected an orphan. These are sins that resonate on a frequency deeper than politics. We can forgive a king for losing a war. We cannot forgive a mother figure for devouring her young. The wicked stepmother trope sticks to her because it fits so perfectly. She had no blood right to the throne. She clawed her way there. She was not beautiful. She was severe. She was not loved. She was feared. In the great fairy tale of the Danish Golden Age, she provides the necessary shadow that makes the light seem brighter. Without Juliana Maria, there is no tragic Queen Caroline to mourn. Without Juliana Maria, there is no heroic struggle for the crown prince to overcome. She is the essential antagonist, the dragon that makes the knight a hero. Today, if you visit the crypts of Roskilde Cathedral, you can stand before her sarcophagus. It is grand, imposing, and cold. There are rarely flowers there, Visitors tend to flock to the other tombs, to the tragic Caroline Matilda, whose body is not there, but whose spirit permeates the history, or to the great warrior kings. Juliana Maria lies in the silence she created, but perhaps in the end she would not mind the silence. She was a woman who valued order above all else. She took a chaotic, scandalous, crumbling court and hammered it into a shape that could endure. She sacrificed her humanity for her dynasty. She died unloved so that the monarchy could live. It is a terrifying bargain, the kind made by villains in stories and statesmen in reality. As we leave her there, in the dark, we are left with the chilling realization that the wicked stepmother was not a monster who invaded the palace from the outside. She was the system itself, stripping away love and mercy to protect the cold, hard machinery of power. She is the reminder that the throne does not care who sits on it, as long as they are willing to sign the paper, spill the ink, and ignore the weeping in the next room. The fairy tale ends, but the lesson remains. Beware the quiet ones in the corner, for they are watching, they are calculating, and they are waiting for the king to sleep.